suspended for good. Donald Trump's been banned from a number of social media platforms for breaching their terms of use, and many say it's about time. But is that a crackdown on freedom of speech? And how has social media helped those in power push their agendas? This is Inside Story. Hello, I'm Kamahl Santamaria. For years, Twitter was Donald Trump's go-to platform to promote his policies, to attack his critics, and to spread misinformation. But on Friday, Twitter said enough and permanently suspended his account due to a risk of further incitement of violence. That is, the President of the United States banned for encouraging violence in his own country. Social media platforms were under growing pressure to take action against Trump after hundreds of his supporters stormed Capitol Hill in Washington on Wednesday. More than 50 people are now facing charges for taking part. And now, with just 10 days left in his presidency, Trump could become the first president to be impeached twice. Democrats want to hold him accountable for the violence that left 5 people dead, including a police officer. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi has said if he doesn't resign immediately, she will ensure he is impeached. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. We're focusing on the online aspect here because actually many political leaders worldwide use social media as tools for communication and indeed propaganda. Like Rodrigo Duterte in 2015, when he decided to run for president of the Philippines, he allegedly recruited a marketing consultant to assemble an army of social media activists with a budget of $200,000. The money was used to pay hundreds of prominent online figures to flood social media with comments supporting Duterte and attacking his critics. He's since taken advantage of the social media landscape, which has helped him keep his high approval rating. And Brazil's President Jair Bolsonaro, well, back in July, Facebook suspended a network of social media accounts it said were used to spread divisive political messages by his employees and 2 of his sons. Bolsonaro had also been accused of fraud, spreading fake news on social media and coordinating online campaigns to smear opponents during the 2018 runoff election. So there is more to this story than just Donald Trump. We're going to discuss all of this with our panel shortly. But first, let's just establish some rules, Twitter's rules at least, on violent content. Twitter doesn't allow violent threats against an individual or a group. It also bans the glorification of violent acts that could inspire others to take part in similar ones. The consequences of breaching its policy, well, they depend on the severity of the violation and the previous history of violations. First breach, Twitter requires the content to be removed and then temporarily locks the account. And if violations continue after a warning, well, the account is permanently suspended. So let me introduce you to today's panel then. Social media experts from different fields, starting in New York City. We've got Jim Anderson, CEO of Social Flow, a company specializing in distributing social media content. Further north to Ithaca, upstate New York, and Claire Wardle, the US branch director at First Draft, a nonprofit aimed at tackling misinformation. And rounding out the panel in Oaxaca, Mexico, is Mark Douglas, CEO and founder of the adtech firm Steelhouse. So welcome to all of you. Claire, I'm going to start with you. I outlined there Twitter's rules, its policies on violence, and it goes on. As I was looking in their blog, they say, we made it clear going back years that these accounts, i.e. leadership accounts, presidential accounts, are not above our rules entirely and cannot use Twitter to incite violence, among other things. So they're saying, well, we've been saying this for years. I mean, arguably, should this have happened a while ago?
It's very easy with 2020 hindsight to look back at individual tweets and say that showed something they should have acted earlier. And in fact, Trump did tweet that the events on the 6th were going to be wild. Well, now we look back at that and say, well, was that an incitement to violence? But it's very difficult to talk about incitement if the violence doesn't happen. A lot of this is really subjective. So, of course, as we sit here now and we look at the kind of the way this has escalated over the last 4 years, and we look at his speech, we think, oh, they should have done something. But when would have been that moment that they should have done something? And it would be very difficult to take the US president down, as we've seen with the response now, which is this too much? So I do have some sympathy for Twitter, but I'm interested to see what historians will say in 50 years' time.
Yeah, I'm thinking of one moment, though. I mean, again, not that you could just pinpoint it on one thing, but do you remember when the looting starts, the shooting starts? Which, I mean, that sounds like clear incitement to me.
Yes, and there was definitely conversations then which said this should be taken down, or should he have been suspended? Should he have been totally banned? They added, we've seen over the last 6 months, they started adding more labels. They stopped people being able to retweet. You can see at the headquarters of Twitter, they kept being like, oh, and kept adding different things. But yeah, I mean, historians, I think, will look back and say, well, hang on, why wasn't more done in the summer when we absolutely saw with the protests in June, President Trump tweeting all sorts of things that now in hindsight, we probably should have taken stronger action against.
Jim Anderson, did Twitter in the end just buckle under pressure? I mean, the result of what we saw of that incitement on Capitol Hill, or was this, as Claire points out, an accumulative thing? They started putting the warnings on. They gave him a warning, then they suspended it. Was it always going to happen?
Well, Kamahl, I think it definitely is a cumulative thing. I mean, everything needs to be looked in context. I can't agree more with what Claire said. I mean, all of these things are much easier in hindsight. Even the phrase "when the looting starts, the shooting starts," that didn't actually directly lead to violence, at least not that was clearly approved. And politicians are masters of wordsmith, right? If you're going to be an effective politician, you're going to have to be very articulate and very good with the language. And one of the things that Donald Trump in particular has always said is, oh, that's not what I meant. That's not what I said, right? These things are open to interpretation. And if you look at the tweet that seems to have finally been the last straw for Twitter, it was a pretty innocuous tweet about, I'm not going to attend the inauguration. I read that and I'm like, okay, he's not going to be there. Well, Twitter looked at it and I think quite rightly said, well, that could be perceived as an incitement to violence, by some of his supporters. And so, wow, that's the territory we're in when a very innocuous tweet like "I'm not going to be at the inauguration" can very legitimately be viewed multiple different ways.
But see, that's what makes me wonder, Jim, if Twitter just said, oh my gosh, we have to do something now, because there is so much, and not just Twitter, other ones, Facebook as well. They've said, what is it, 3 strikes or however many strikes it's been, and you're out.
Yeah. Well, you have to ask yourself what's different now. What's different when Twitter finally made that decision? Well, what's different is what happened last Wednesday, right? The incitement to violence at the Capitol, where 5 people died, right? So now we do have that benefit of hindsight. We can look back and say, wow, look what happened. We can see a very clear path between, Donald Trump's invitation to everybody to come to the rally. It will be wild. And then it was wild in a very negative way. And then I think, like you said, Twitter finally said, this is enough and we're done.
Mark Douglas, let's bring you in from Oaxaca. Was there room to interpret Donald Trump's tweets in different ways? And does it give him, or did it give him, the wiggle room to say, oh, no, that's not what I meant?
Well, I think one key thing here is there's no legal standard for this, right? So if you were to take those tweets and let's say somehow took those into court for some reason, I don't think anyone's going to say those tweets, and quite frankly, most, if not all of Donald Trump's tweets, have ever directly incited violence. So these rules there's no legal standard for them. They're just literally Twitter's rules from their lens, Facebook's rules through their lens, and so my thought is where's the standard on this as the objective standard as opposed to the subjective standard, which speaks directly to the previous comment as to, well, the tweet that seemed to be the one that really triggered this seems to be very basically say I'm not going to attend an event. It's obviously not an incitement to violence. So.
But you've made a really good point there about the legal standing, because in the end, we're talking about a private company, aren't we? Twitter provides a service. If you sign up to it, and all 3 of us are signed up to it, if you do, or 4 of us, I should say, I should include myself, we abide by the rules, and if we don't like it, then we leave, or we get thrown off. I mean, it's just the way it works, right?
Yeah. Well, the U.S. law is definitely, the First Amendment of the Constitution was really, in terms of censorship, which obviously people don't like the word censorship, but obviously all these companies are engaged in it. And whether they think they have a good reason or a bad reason, they're doing it, right? And so that really envisioned the U.S. government censoring, things like newspapers. It didn't envision, worldwide global companies essentially censoring U.S. citizens. And so I think that, that's something that eventually this whole area is, I think, eventually going to have to go to the courts and maybe even to the Supreme Court.
Let's just pause for a second because I want to read you a tweet. It's not a Donald Trump tweet, but it's something I came across in research for the show. And it actually comes from Alexei Navalny, who is, of course, the Russian opposition leader. And he posted a thread of about 8 tweets about this, and I've just picked a couple of them out here. He said, "I think that the ban on Donald Trump on Twitter is an unacceptable act of censorship based on emotions and personal political preferences." He then goes on to say, "Don't tell me he was banned for violating Twitter rules. I get death threats here every day for many years, and Twitter doesn't ban anyone." Mark, I'll start with you, and then I'll come back to the other guests. I mean, he makes a good point, whether you agree with Alexei Navalny's politics or not. He does make a good point that there is nasty stuff going on out there every day. And you will see people online complaining all the time saying, why is this person not being blocked? Why are they not being suspended? They are actually threatening my life.
Yeah, well, I want to not get too political, and obviously,
sure.
But the Communist Party of China, their Twitter account is active, but the president of the United States is not. So I think that says a lot that in terms of the standards. Now, Twitter is a U.S. based company based in California. This is obviously through the lens of the people that work through Twitter, not through the lens of legislation or really any truly impartial and independent view.
Claire was, sorry, Mark, I just want to bring Claire back in. Is there too much focus on Donald Trump just because he is the president of the United States and was so prominent on Twitter? I mean, I mentioned Navalny there. We talked about Bolsonaro before. We talked about Duterte. This is not isolated to this one man.
No, it's not. And we're seeing lots of people online saying, this is unprecedented. And of course, there are many people around the world being like, no, it's not. There have been leaders from all sorts of other countries that have had actions taken against them. We've seen lots of other moments when content has been taken down. But of course, these companies are based in the US, and therefore Donald Trump, in many ways, was a world leader. Everybody was following Trump's Twitter account. And so you can see there's a lot of pressure on Silicon Valley. But I do just want to say this. Content moderation is essentially impossible at scale. Even if we had 99% accuracy, even if we believe these decisions were objective, they're not. They're subjective decisions. And so ultimately at that place, I completely agree that there is all sorts of content on many social platforms every day. And I look at them and say, how on earth is that still up? But the amount of content that gets uploaded every single day means that this is impossible. Should the platforms be doing much more? Yes. Should they be investing much more? Yes. Should we as a society be having more conversations about what we think is acceptable or not? Yes. But many of these platforms are less than 20 years old, and we're figuring this stuff out, and it's really, really hard. And we're seeing where mistakes are happening.
OK, I'll come back to you in a moment, Claire, to talk more about misinformation. Jim, seeing as you specialise in the distribution of social media, let's pick up on what Claire said there. Stuff is being posted every second. There's so many videos going up on YouTube at every moment, so many tweets, so many posts and all that. Are we just really chasing our own tails here? Or do we hold those people, politicians, world leaders, people of influence, do we hold them to a higher standard and say, no, you can't do that?
Well, we are chasing our tail to a degree. I will agree with Claire. I mean, this is really impossible at scale. Impossible to do perfectly. It's not impossible to try. And I think we ought to make a distinction. It's one thing to not be able to be 100% successful. It's quite another to just not try at all. Throwing up your hands and saying, sorry, it's too hard is clearly not an answer. But I want to disagree with what Mark said when he talked about, is it okay for the Chinese Communist Party to be on Twitter, but the president of the United States to not be? I think that's framing the issue the wrong way. It's not a value judgment about the president of the United States as a position or a value judgment about the Chinese Communist Party. It's a judgment about the behavior, about what specifically was tweeted. And when Twitter finally took the step, you can agree whether that should have been the last straw or not, but it was based on a specific set of actions, a cumulative set of thousands and thousands of tweets and behaviors. And it wasn't a value judgment on the presidency of the United States. It was a judgment about the behavior of the current president of the United States.
Mark?
Well, I mean, I see I don't totally disagree with the point. I mean, I think the thing is that should these companies be engaged in censorship or not? For example, we didn't mention Parler. So Parler has been essentially, it's been taken out of Google App Store, the Apple App Store, out of Amazon Web Services. It's basically an attempt to completely shut it down. So the company will relaunch probably a week from now, but now with all the servers hosted outside the United States and with a web version and things like that. So having U.S. companies be making these judgments in any means, I think personally, the Communist Party should be on Twitter, as well as Donald Trump, as well as I don't think any of these companies should be engaged in any form of censorship. If these platforms are being used for violence, we have the Department of Justice of the United States of America to deal with that. We don't need Twitter, Apple, Amazon, and Facebook to be trying to serve that role.
Okay. As I see it, we've got two issues here. We've discussed, obviously, the issue of inciting violence, which is what's brought us to this conversation today. But, Claire, I'll bring you in because, well, your job is to fight misinformation. And you look at the misinformation, or shall we just say lies, which have been put out by President Trump, by, again, any number of prominent people on social media. Is that a punishable offence? Can you make that a punishable offence? Because you were saying earlier that all these things can be quite subjective as well.
Yeah, and misinformation is a form of legal speech. So sometimes people say, well, Claire, surely this stuff should just be taken down. But that is really, really a slippery slope, because a lot of this is a grey area. A lot of the most effective misinformation is based on a kernel of truth. So one of my concerns as I look at many of the people that were caught up in the events on Wednesday is you hear their friends and family now say they were radicalized. I've had to stop talking to them over the last 2 years. They've been completely lost in an alternative reality. So this is bigger than just talking about, oh, there's some rumors and conspiracies online. There are people who are completely locked into this alternative information ecosystem. So there's a lot for us to think about. And I think in many ways, we've been shocked, deeply shocked by what happened on Wednesday, but how did we get there? And I think many people just recognize we were having these conversations about free speech, which of course all of us on this call support. But what we don't have is longitudinal research to say, what does it mean if you see this content every single day? So yes, in a perfect world, I want everybody to be able to say whatever they want. But I keep coming back to historians. In 50 years' time, are we going to look back at this period of time and say, oh my God, they were letting everything go, and it led to, I don't want to be hyperbolic, but like a collapse of democracy. It's been a difficult week, but I do think we have to recognize what these kind of speech patterns have led to in terms of people's belief systems.
No, you're absolutely right. History is going to judge this period very, well, maybe harshly or interestingly at least. Jim, I want to come back to you as well. Should we be concerned? We've been all discussing the issue of the companies here, Twitter, Facebook, Google. Should we be concerned that so few companies are now really controlling, what we say, what we read, or at least having so much of a say in it?
Yeah, I think we should. Obviously I disagree with Mark on a couple of those points, but I think, the idea that a few big tech companies have so much control over our lives as individuals, or a company, Parler was the example he used, I think is a topic for discussion. I happen to think in the case of Parler, in the case of our current situation where violence is being promoted and people are organizing with the idea of committing violence, those big companies are caught between a rock and a hard place, to use the phrase. What are they supposed to do? Just sit back and like Mark suggests, let the Justice Department take care of it? I do not believe history would judge that very well. When you see that kind of behavior going on, you need to take action. But we do have a very few companies, Apple, Google, Amazon, the three of the largest tech companies in the world. They make a decision about your company, your platform, or maybe you as an individual. There's very little recourse. And so in the case of Parler, is in many ways a good example. It's going to be very difficult for them to continue as an ongoing business, certainly at the level of success that they had been having and the level of growth. It ultimately, I think, ends up being an antitrust conversation as much as anything. Do we want, as a society, in the U.S. and the U.K., different, geographic, sort of entities have their own regulations there, but I think there's a very definite conversation about how big is too big.
You also have something in the United States called Section 230. This is of the Communications Decency Act. And for any of our viewers who don't know, this decides how, or allows the companies to decide how they moderate their content, and B, protects them from liability from what users post. Jim, Donald Trump has railed against that, among many other things. But again, is there some logic to the idea that actually that needs to be reviewed?
Well, the great irony with Donald Trump did rail against, Section 230. He tried to insert it in an unrelated defense spending authorization
Well,
bill.
yes.
Yeah, it's kind of crazy because the great irony is if we had repealed Section 230, like he said, his account would have been taken down almost immediately because, all of a sudden Twitter would have been liable for what he said. And so the violence that ended up happening, you could have made a case that said, wow, Twitter, you're liable for the violence because you didn't moderate or censor effectively enough. So the great irony is some of the loudest voices about repealing Section 230, the logical consequence of that would be tech companies taking an even bigger set of responsibilities about what we can say or see or do online. And so when I think we really get into a more substantive and less emotional debate about Section 230 in the U.S. Congress, at least, I suspect you're going to see Republicans and conservatives actually say, now, wait a minute, not so fast. We're not in favor of censorship, which, repealing or modifying Section 230 would be, in fact, encouraging more tech moderation, or if you think it's censorship, that.
Mark, do you see, well, what do you see as being the future of something like Section 230?
Well, I think that was a really good point that was just made, and so that Section 230 can go both ways. So I think it kind of really centers back to having universal standards if we are going to apply rules here. Having universal standards. I think one interesting thing is the phrase misinformation was used earlier a lot, or alternate information. A lot of what people think are alternate facts or alternate information are just alternate perspective. And I think that's where things are really making people upset, is just that if one person just simply has a different perspective on something than another person, calling that alternate information. I don't think that's what was being said, but that's what I think is happening. And so I think that's something that really has to be looked at. In terms of 230, I think something is going to happen there. It's going to really take a lot of discussion in Congress and the Senate and possibly even, like I said, involve the courts to really sort out what these companies should be doing in this area and what they shouldn't be doing.
Folks, we're starting to run down the clock, so I just want to get one final thought, and then I'll put it to you, Claire. The idea that whilst a lot of us have all been up in arms about this, and I was tweeting about it the other day as well and saying, isn't it concerning about this regulation or concerns over free speech? And a colleague of mine tweeted back and said, well, actually, hasn't information always been regulated in one way or another, even by, and I'm using the word loosely here, us, the so-called mainstream media who put out news and sort of decide what people can consume and can't. This is just an evolution, but a very fast evolution of that.
Yeah, it absolutely is an evolution. And it goes back to my point, which is, as society, we should be having these conversations, because I feel deeply troubled that some people in Silicon Valley are making these decisions and there's absolutely no oversight, no transparency, no other body or agency or organization that can be part of those conversations. And these decisions are just being taken. And this content is being taken down. So I keep talking about historians. A lot of this content is disappearing. We can't even look at it. So yes, it's an evolution, but we have to start thinking about what are some oversight mechanisms for these decisions that are being taken by these private companies.
Jim, do you think in the end, the events of this past week, and not just what happened on Capitol Hill, but what's happened on social media, will serve as a warning in the end, that others might actually look at it and go, well, we really do have to play by the rules here, by Twitter's rules, by Facebook's rules, because, well, them's the rules?
Yeah, without a doubt. I think a new standard has been set. There's going to be post what happened when President Trump's Twitter account was banned and pre. And clearly, one of the legitimate criticisms has been of social platforms, like you can't clearly define where the line is, right? Your standards keep moving. You have uneven enforcement. You play different rules for different people, and that's not fair. Well, clearly now there is a line that you can go across, and Twitter has shown where that line is, at least in this case.
Well, one of the things about us mainstream media is that we are limited in our time occasionally, and that's just what's happened here. So I want to thank you, Jim Anderson in New York, Claire Wardle in Ithaca, and Mark Douglas in Oaxaca. A pleasure having all of you on Inside Story. And thank you to you for watching as well. Remember, there's always plenty more online at aljazeera.com. First of all, that's where you can see this show and any of our previous editions again. We also encourage plenty of smart, respectful discussion at facebook.com/AJ Inside Story, on Twitter at AJ Inside Story, and I'm at Kamahl AJE, where I've always got something to say, most of it intelligible. From the whole Inside Story team, thanks for joining us. We'll see you again soon.